that Safiya Sinclair agreed to join us this year for our book festival, I was over the moon. I grew up in Montego Bay, Jamaica, to a Rasta mom who was a rebel and stepped out of our very religious family and fell in love, as she will say, with a Rasta man. And we grew up in a very liberal Rastafarian family. And I attended Montego Bay High School for Girls, Ese Non Videri, with her sister, Ife. All of my cousins went to Cornwall College with Lidge. And in our household, your names echoed constantly. We always heard, and we didn't know Esther's name, but my mom would always say, the Rasta lady with the 3 children. We always heard that. They were almost like celebrities in the academic world in Jamaica, especially on the high school level growing up. So we always heard their name. Lidge was always on TV on the debate team, and I always wanted to be a debater. So I would sit and I would just watch and study everything that came out of his mouth, and I could never compare. Could never. So it was, I was just over the moon to learn that you were coming. Your book changed my life as an adult, reading about that and just thinking about it. It's interesting to think about Jamaica when you're from Jamaica, looking through a completely different lens and daring to question the things that you hear, daring to be different, and to step out of the mold a little bit and let the fire that burns within you truly set ablaze and find your own path. So for a very non-traditional young lady from a very non-traditional family, I'm going to ask all of you to do something very non-traditional to this book foundation. So all of you who can, I'm gonna ask you two to keep seated. Please stand with me. And I'm gonna give you some very basic instructions. I'm going to ask you to, and I'm asking you to take it from the pit of your stomachs, okay? I want, when you say this, I love that the doors are open, I want the people in downtown Nantucket Historic District to hear this word that I never thought I would hear this frequently outside of Jamaica, okay? And I want it to bellow out of you like a dragon breathing fire, okay? So, and I'm asking you to take that fire that Esther kindled in her children and let it out onto these streets, okay? After 3 together, we're gonna bellow Babylon. So 1, 2, 3. Babylon! There we go. Safiya, you can all be seated. I wanna thank you for teaching us how to say Babylon and for telling us what Babylon was in the first place. I don't know if any of you knew that. So thank you so much. Mary, I'm gonna hand it over to you. Thank you for bringing her to this island. We are so honored to have you. I hope if you haven't taken the time to read the book, that you really sit down and dive into it. It was beautifully written. It really and truly reads like a poem. Your life is like a beautiful poem, and I appreciate you sharing it with us.
Whew. Thank you so much. I'm already emotional before we even begin.
I know, as it really should be. I mean, I actually this is the second reading, and if you can see, it became almost compulsive because it's so beautifully written and powerful. And to start with this, I would say that Joan Didion's line, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live," has never resonated with more truth than in reading this book. And when did you know you had a story to tell?
Well, first, Mary, please, I want to say thank you so much to you for everything you do with this festival, for inviting me, to all of you who put this festival together. I've been to a lot of these, and I have to say, the last 2 days, I've been so heartened and so inspired being here at the festival and seeing the things that you're doing also for young people, to sort of interweave their love for literature. I mean, it really is crucial work. And so I'm really so happy to be here. It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Well, we are all so grateful you are. And for everyone who does not know, actually Safiya had called to kind of cancel this book festival because she was up for this incredibly prestigious award in London. And I said, well, Safiya, what if you got on a plane Saturday morning and you flew all day? And she even connected on Cape Air. And can I tell you how many writers really freak out on Cape Air? No problem. She said, no problem, I'll get on Cape Air. And she literally arrived late yesterday afternoon. Her bags arrived shortly before she was on stage yesterday. So it's Herculean effort that you made to be with us. So we are so very grateful. All right, so we have to go back because
Yes.
really it's we tell stories in
Yes.
order to live. And that just felt all over this book.
Yeah. I think a lot about storytelling and the way that it functions, particularly in the Caribbean. And I mean that to say, in the Caribbean, where we're descended from people who we don't always have our histories written. In a lot of ways, our histories have been kind of tattered and fractured because of enslavement. And so because of that, in the Caribbean, the oral tradition is a very important one. You know, we tell our folklore, we tell our histories through just sit down and let me tell you a story, you know? And in Jamaica, when we say, I'm gonna tell you a story, I mean, I'm gonna tell you a story. And a lot of our oral folkloric tradition in Jamaica and the Caribbean is something that's passed down matrilineally. It is something that the women give to their daughters, to their children, that they pass down. And I think a lot and write a lot about the women in the Caribbean being the keepers of our history. And I was fortunate enough that my mother is an excellent storyteller. And so from the moment I could remember, like being 4 years old, my mother would sit me down in front of the sea of our seaside home, and she would tell me the story of our lives. And she would tell it to me over and over and over like a song. And once I got older, I realized, well, I have to write this down. Because I also felt the importance of bearing witness to our histories. And particularly a lot of the stories my mother told me, I said, well, I need to remember this. And I need whoever comes next, that she will know it. And so for me, that idea of writing my story as something crucial and necessary to survival is a large part of how I think about my work and what I wanted to do in the world.
Well, the story that you told, though, is one not really known. I mean, here on this island, you know, there's a wonderful, when Bob Marley songs, you know, Chicken Box always has. And I had no idea what the Rastafarian culture actually was. Yes. And you paint this scene, and you need to tell the history of it, but with Haile Selassie's plane coming down, and it really is very biblical because suddenly the sun, through torrential rain, suddenly the sun is glinting on the silver of the plane, and it's as if the skies are parting. And there are thousands and thousands of Rastafarians that have swarmed the airport to greet who they think is a Messiah. That history is not known. In here, at least I think here in America, not really known. Can you explain to us what this means?
Yes, of course. And it's a history that's also not that well known in Jamaica. And so, you know, it was interesting writing the book, knowing that Rastafari holds this sort of broad space in the global imagination, right? When people think about Jamaica, this is the thing they think defines Jamaica. And I think most people would be surprised to know that Rastafari in Jamaica are about 1% or less of the population. Might be surprised to know that the Rastafari are historically a persecuted minority in Jamaica. You know, when the Rasta movement began in the early 1930s, it was categorized as a cult by the British government, which was still, Jamaica was still under colonial rule at that time. Rastas at that time were kind of ostracized. They were outcast. They were kicked out of their homes. They were forbidden from having jobs. They were turned away from their families. They were forbidden from walking along the beach sides that were being developed for tourists. And so the Rastafari always, had this kind of struggle in Jamaican history. And I knew writing the book, I wanted to re-narrativize this idea that people have of Rastafari as the thing that really defines Jamaica. And then particularly to tell my story as a young woman growing up inside of Rastafari, what that would be like, that my siblings and I were the only Rasta children at school. We're among the first Rasta children to be allowed to be integrated into public schools is something that might also surprise you. And so it was important for me to tell this story. And I needed to begin where it was tethered to Haile Selassie, right? Who was the man who inspired this movement, because he was at the time, the only Black ruler in the world in the 1930s. And so for the citizens of Jamaica who were still under colonial rule and didn't have their freedoms, they saw him as an aspirational figure of Black liberation. And when he came to Jamaica, I couldn't resist going to the archives and describing this scene, because how often will you get the opportunity to really tell this story of a man landing to thousands of people who believe he is the Messiah?
And that scene that you paint, and it's a critical piece of history to help us understand what the numbers actually are and the beliefs that are fervent. And those beliefs became the bedrock of belief, and it extended generations, and it pulled your father in. And it's a choice that irrevocably changed his life and all of yours. What was it about the Rasta culture that you think became that incredibly powerful pull for your father?
It's always interesting when I try my best not to kind of put words in his mouth and say why he did the things he did, but I also try my best to kind of guess at it, right? When I was writing the book, I asked him, I did a lot of interviews with him because I wanted to know why he was drawn to Rastafari. And my father's like, he's a Rasta man, so he speaks in his very particular way. I don't know if you've ever spoken to a Rasta man, but
I think you need to give just an example of this.
So, the Rastafari have their own kind of vernacular, their own kind of dialect, which comes from this anti-colonial place, which the idea is to upend English language. Anything that's of empire, of Western society is what they call Babylon. And so the language itself is something that they reject and twist as a rejection of Babylon. And so, for example, a Rasta person won't say understand, they'll say overstand. They won't say appreciate, they say appreciate love. My father also does things like, he doesn't say continually, he says itinually.
And also, just how does he refer when he talks about himself?
Yeah, so
what does he say?
he doesn't refer to himself in the singular. He doesn't say me. He says I and I. The idea is that the Rasta man is never alone, that Jah is always with him, and so it's a collective spirit instead of an individual one. So my father will just say like, I and I wish that the I is having a good day continually, and this is like, every sentence is like this, right? And so it's its own kind of language that my siblings and I learned growing up. And so, it was important for me to kind of capture that on the page as well when I'm writing about.
Which you did. You beautifully, well, first of all, this is Safiya's gifts as a poet. I mean, she began as a poet. I actually met her many, many years ago at Penn Faulkner as a poet. She has won awards. And she brings her gorgeous language, her gift of poetry into this book. Every page, again, I had to stop. Like, they're just 10,000 pages. I could have marked every page. What I also, of course, learned, and for many of us who are reading this book, again, it's an eye-opener how repressively patriarchal that Rastafarian culture is. And it's passed down from men. And you wrote your father in this very nuanced, complex, very deeply humane manner. We understand there's a frame, there's pain, there is abandonment. It just doesn't diminish the sense of rage that we feel. as we follow this story. So in the midst of all of this, because your life is so complicated, and it begins with this haunted image of a woman, and it's an image that you imagined you might become if you didn't burn your path to get out of it. All the fear you had carried, you said, gave way to fire. Tell us these beginnings, because I do know, and I'm actually happy to say, there's always a savior in every story. The savior is sitting right before us. Her mother, Esther Norman. Esther Norman, please stand up and take a bow. And we talk about the importance of educators, and that is what Esther Norman is. And she put in her children's hands the gift, the power, the love of language. So how did you, Safiya, begin to find your voice?
You know, it's just as you say, by pinpointing my mother, it really was through language and through poetry. You know, when I was going to school and I began to feel very outcast by, not just by the students and by my peers, but also by my teachers. Because being a young Rasta girl in school, you know, the larger Jamaican society, which is predominantly Christian, really made me and my siblings feel unwanted. Even though we were the smartest, as Chantal can attest. Yes, yes. But, you know, there was a moment when I was 10 years old, and I write about this in the book, where I had a friend. You know, I thought I had a friend, and I was very excited. But one day she sent someone with a note to me that said, "I don't want to be your friend. I don't want to be friends with a Rasta." And at 10 years old, this crushed me, you know? And it was the first time I began to feel ashamed to be myself. And I tried to harm myself. And my mother, at that time, I think she knew, and she saw that I was drowning and I needed help. And she handed me a collection of poems called Poems from a Child's World. And she said, "You know, poetry for me had always been the thing that made my world wild and wide and warmer." And then she laughed and said, "That's alliteration." I said, "Oh my God, what is alliteration?" And the damage was kind of done at that point, you know, and I remember reading the book, and I'd read this, you know, William Blake poem, The Tiger, and at 10 years old, I just remember my mind kind of just like coming alive. And I remember viscerally the feeling of hurt and woundedness that I'd had from my friend, you know, saying this horrible thing to me. I felt it evaporating. I felt it physically leaving me. And at 10 years old, that was a moment of wonder. And it was then through poetry that I realized a world could be transformed through words. Yeah, and I just kept following that wonder.
And there are so many threads that you do pull and follow, and words are it. But also, again, I just to reference back to your mother, that in that moment, too, when you step on that wood and you let that nail really pierce your foot, and it's like your mother always intuitively understood your pain and had said, "Where you go, I will come with you." And that's a theme throughout your life, too. Wherever you go, I will come with you. And there was a therapist I worked with on a network television show. We were working on scripts. And they always said, one person, if there's one person in a child's life, that's what you need, one person. So it's beautiful threads that we pull so much. And you know, as a woman, as a mother, it's just hard to suppress the rage I felt in this really vastly patriarchal society and in the increasingly constricted world that your father imposed on you. And for those, again, who will find this out, it's like it became a household in which, for women, it was virtues, purity, you know, and for a Rasta man, that was the symbol of your success, is you had your daughters and your wife that were symbols of purity and virtue. very, very difficult to have to, it's insupportable. So, but you were always this spirited girl. At 4 years old, told never to go into the sea, and you did this. You were always this incredible spirit that saw the beauty and wonder, and you wander into that sea, and again, it is your mother who races out to save you from drowning. It's not the first time, and it's a quiet strength, and it's always not fighting or railing against that system, but being present. And we learn what that means to just, you can be present and you can be that fighter. You talked about making magic happen and that gift of poetry. How did that thread keep going in your life?
Yeah, I want to pick up on a couple things that you said. To talk a little bit, before I talk about the poetry, talk a little bit about, expanding on growing up in this household that the older I got, I think the more restrictive the rules became. And again, most people, I think, have kind of one particular idea of Rastafari in their mind. They probably, when they think of it, they think reggae music. They probably have in their mind the image of one man in particular, and never really think, well, what is a Rasta girl's life like? What are
also, could you explain, because for anyone who might not understand, there's also a very significant symbol that has to happen on your head.
Yes.
Can you explain that?
Yes. So I think most people, you probably see dreadlocks and think, okay, reggae, Rastafari, but I think you wouldn't know that it's not a choice to wear the dreadlocks, right? We had to grow the dreadlocks as a sacred marker of Rastafari. It kind of represents your level of devotion to Jah, which is what they call, the Godhead figure, Haile Selassie. And so, my siblings and I had to grow the dreadlocks, which then became a thing that people would, tease us about and make comments about. But particularly for the girls and the women, we also had rules on how we could dress and how we could think. In my household, I kind of grew up being told a woman's place is to be silent, obedient, and pliant. We weren't really allowed to have opinions. We had to kind of cover our knees, cover our arms. Some Rasta women had to cover their hair. And these rules didn't really extend to my brother. And so there was a certain moment around 9 or 10 where I did begin to question some of these because, my siblings and I would run around the yard all the time. We would climb trees. And I remember there was a moment when my father called me to him at 9 years old and he said, well, how tall are you now? And he kind of inspected me of how I was growing. And he said, you can't climb trees anymore because girls don't do that. Meanwhile, my brother was still climbing the trees, and I was like, well, hold on now.
Right, because you write this, you said you discovered, so in this period that you're referring to where suddenly the rules have changed, the freedoms that you had enjoyed and you played with your brother, you said you discovered a seedling of a voice in comprehending the unfairness of your father's position. You, this wild child of the outdoors, inseparable from your brother, and now you were this girl meant to be kept in skirts and long dresses, a role not meant for your brother. And I just have to, it does start marking into a chapter, and there is a chapter in which we just see your father, and again, you write him with tremendous humanity, but your father that descends into this rage that is so punitive and harrowing. All of us who read this, it is the most searing bit of story. In your poetry of this, after this episode with all of you, you and all your siblings saying, you simply deserted the bruised husks of ourselves, walking out of them entirely, the flame of the day extinguished. Can you talk about what it is to survive that moment? And then there is actually a worse moment that happens when you are a young teenager and you alone are the repository of an unmitigated rage that is so devastating. So how, as a young woman, a young girl, how do you find a way to put your feet forward and not let that spirit go?
It's a good question, and I don't even know if I have the answer. It's interesting looking back on it now. I'm like, how did I? survive. But I think I always had this hope that there was something better on the horizon. And if I could just be given a chance to get there, that I would get there. And I never gave up that belief. And I think, again, it was really all thanks to books and to literature, which I could kind of lose myself in the pages of the books, even in those moments of pain and hurt. It was poetry that I think saved me.
And there's a point, and this was very powerful, and again, we keep referring to the power of teachers, educators, that you were this broken and beaten girl, and there was a turning point in a despairing moment where this compassionate teacher, a Mrs. Noonan, she was trying to find, as she told you, the bright and lovely young girl that you once were, and that girl was gone. What did Mrs. Newman say to you that made a difference?
Well, she said, have you ever tried writing it down? You know? And I thought, well, there's a concept. You know, because up until that point, I'd been writing these little poems about, you know, the butterfly, and I love the sunshine, and I love the trees. And my focus had always been external in my writing. But that moment where I was talking to Miss Noonan about how I was feeling, and the feelings were spilling over, you know, as it often does when you're a teenager anyway. And she said, well, Safiya, have you tried to write it down?
Here's what, first of all, again, to give you a window into the extraordinary intellect, intelligent heart and soul of what was a very young woman. She asked you how you saw your future. You said, I looked out the window and reached for the future, you told her. I want to grab the bull by its horn and stitch my name to its tongue.
Yeah, that's true.
I don't know about you, but I just don't. I don't think in such beautifully poetic images.
Yes. And, you know, and I realized then that there was an entire internal emotional landscape that I didn't have to just feel it. I could do something with the feeling. And my thought was, well, if I can change this feeling, if I can take this hurt and write it down, I can alchemize it into something different, into something better, into something beautiful. And that's what I've been trying to do ever since.
Of course, you have more than succeeded, but there is another moment that I find so powerful, and it's in the years where there are despairing years. You're waiting, you don't have college tuition. You have been accepted, but you cannot pay for college. So, you know, year by year, you're waiting to gather that kind of money, and there is a really despairing moment in which thoughts of death are not that far away for you, and you pick up a shard of glass, and with the cry, please help me, that you're considering, this glass glints silver in the light, and this silver light actually brings change into your world and leads to really a powerful, I don't know, it is like almost godlike. It's a powerful moment in which the light shines in. Can you tell us about that? And possibly, I do have to read silver. Or could you do it by stand? It'll be up to you. But tell about that moment where that silver glints on the glass shard that you were contemplating.
Yes. You're asking me these hard questions, Mary Haft.
Powerful.
You know, yes, this was a moment of despair. And this was particularly because I felt really voiceless in my household, and because I felt like I had worked so hard during, you know, my high school years, my teenage years. I'd done everything that had been asked of me. I was pure. I was obedient. I was the best. But because of circumstances outside of my control, I wasn't able to go to college when all of my friends were going to college. And this is just it felt like such an impossible thing to overcome then when you're 16 years old, and really just aching to continue learning and continue I wanted to see, well, what can I do next? What can I be next? And it felt so unfair that I couldn't. And on top of that, I lived, in a household where my father really wanted to control how I thought, what I did, how I could speak and not speak. And so it did feel a little bit hopeless in that moment. But then I was thinking about, actually, which I don't say in the book, I was thinking about my grandmother, my mother's mother, who had died when my mother was 4 years old and who I never met. But in that moment of despair, when I said, please help me, I actually was speaking to her. And yes, there was this silver glint, and all of a sudden this line came in my head, silver flows through my veins. And I thought, okay, what's next? And the lines kept coming, and I really just ran back to my room and started writing this poem. And that was the last time I ever felt that kind of despair, because I knew that poetry was always there with me, and that she would lead me, that poet would lead me where I needed to go.
The lines are beautiful, I'll just say. So silver flows through my veins.
Yes, I can read it.
Yes, I wish you would.
And when it's the most startling thing, because this is a poem I wrote when I was 16. And it was also among my first published poem. It actually got published in the national newspaper in Jamaica. And it marked a turning point, because it was the first time I'd always felt like maybe I have something to say. But when it got published, I said, well, now I have something, not just something to say, but people actually care what I have to say. And it felt like very crucial to me at that point, coming from a house where I was told, don't say a thing, and anything you have to say, I don't care. And so I don't think my 16-year-old self could have imagined this very moment where I'm sitting here with all of you, and the poem I wrote then is published in a book and I'm talking to you about it. So I'll read the poem, and I always preface it with saying, I wrote it at 16. Just remember that, okay? Silver. Silver flows through my veins, into my hands when I caress the strings of my guitar. Silver is the moon I swallowed on a dry, dreary night when I willed it so. Silver is the rain in May, wholesome and live and falling into me. Or springtime saraband kisses me sodden. Up, then I'm happy, down, then I'm sad. Silver, I cry, silver. Silver encases my heart like a drunk jeweler quenching a cigarette. Silver is my lips against the ice, my tongue upon the frost, my sweet staccato, my praline dress, my stuck umbrella on a sunshiny day. Silver is the witty wind coaxing my eyes to sleep upon the blurred pastel pages of a slipshod butterfly. Silver is a legerdemain, legs like a leprechaun that feeds on lyre and lemons, a choir of my deepest thoughts, the inkling of my most secret soul. It is the palsied web of the crestfallen spider, the ugly dewdrop ring that scars my finger like acid, dusk that brings the sidereal night, resting its echo upon the wing of a firefly that drinks the silver from my eyes. Silver is my billowing meerschaum. It's the flicking goldfish fin in the silent sun. Silver are the wispy strands in my hair, lined silver, spiraling through the universe. Silver chose me. Like starlight to the naked eye, the words I bleed are silver. The time that dances minuets upon my broken sylvan skin is silver in a lancer's armor. When my stomach bursts and I disgorge eternity, silver stands beside me, fondling the viol. The weight, the wind are uxorious, for they are solely silver, ever headed my way. My ears are filled with pixies' dreams, like honey, only silver. When the days of maiden's troubles subside, silver peels away, my belly swells, and it'll be a while, but I know more silver is welling inside.
This entire book is poetry in prose. It is really why we would say it is the art of memoir. The entire book is the most beautifully written book I have read in a really long time, because it's written by a poet.
Thank you.
So we're nearly going to be time for questions. I'm always, the themes that echo for me are always redemption, forgiveness. How does that fit in the frame of your family, in the frame of your life?
That's a good question. You know, I mentioned yesterday when I was talking with Kwame that one of the things I learned while writing the book is actually forgiveness. I before I began writing the book would have never thought of myself as a forgiving person. And it was through the act of writing it and needing to tell the story from the beginning, and needing to know why my father chose Rastafari for himself and for us. And there was no way to tell my story without telling that story of his coming to Rastafari. And there was no way to tell his story of coming to Rastafari without sitting down and talking to him. And so already that had to be sort of an act of forgiveness, an act of stepping forward and saying, okay, tell me your story. I'm ready to listen, and I'm ready to write it down. And so, you know, earlier you'd asked me a question of why I thought he came to Rastafari. And I think my father was fatherless. He does not know his father. He never had a family growing up. He had a tough childhood. And I think for him, Rastafari was the thing that gave him a sense of belonging. Even though when I asked him, well, why did you become Rastafari? He said, I and I didn't choose Rasta. I and I was born Rasta. And I'm like, okay, well, but like, why really did you? Like, that sounds good, but like, why? And I think there was something in this sense of belonging to Rastafari, and this thing that gave Black people a sense of selfhood, a sense of liberation. I think that's why he chose it. And I think in Haile Selassie, he found this kind of patriarchal, aspirational figure he never really had when he was growing up, being fatherless himself. And so a lot of this I did not ever understand or think about when I was growing up, because he never told me, and we never asked him, we never felt like we could ask him, And so it was in writing the book that I really had to sit down and think about this, and think about my father as a boy, and think about his own traumas and his own hurts, and how that manifested in his life and then in my life. And that brought to me this forgiveness. There was no way to write it with this sense of nuance, as you say, without first getting to this place of, I don't hold it against you anymore.
So powerful. I mean, all I can say is I hope every single one of you runs out, gets the book. Safiya will be signing after this. We are ready for some questions.
I have a mic.
I'm almost speechless, but I do have a question. I'm very curious.
Coming from you, Michael, that's saying something. He is one of the best interviewers. Michael is one of the best interviews. So Michael Shoulder, thank you.
I can't hold a candle to you in this case. But in any event, have you gotten reaction from Rastafari men and Rastafari women, and have they been different? What have you heard?
Thank you for that question. I also wanted, when I wrote the book, to say this is not the way all Rastafari households were. This was just how my household was. This was just how my father was. And I think Chantal is a good representation of that as well, and that she grew up in a Rasta household that looked very different, that it was liberal, and so it really is, each Rasta man kind of is the godhead of his own household and creates the rules for himself. There's no sort of there's no Bible for Rastafari. There's no one rule or one tenet. Like, they kind of just are able to interpret it or invent it as they go along. So that's important for me to say. I will say that all the Rasta women that I knew growing up have all cut their dreadlocks and left Rastafari. You know, for me, it was a defining moment when I cut my dreadlocks, because I wanted to choose for myself what kind of woman I was gonna be instead of having it being imposed on me. And it was like, it was unheard of. And my father was furious. He didn't talk to me for a year. We lived in the same house. He looked through me like I was a ghost. And then my middle sister then cut her dreadlocks. And then my youngest sister cut her dreadlocks. And then my mother, who had been growing her dreadlocks since she was 19 when she met my father, decided, too, it was her time, and she cut her dreadlocks. And so this is kind of, in my experience, a familiar route for the women that I've known in Rastafari. And Chantal, I'd be interested in knowing, too, your kind of journey to, you know, with the locks and with all of that. But interestingly enough, I've also, the Rasta brethren who have reached out to me have only said good things. Because I did try to be very, I wanted to tell my story how it happened, but also to show Rastafari itself in its complexities and nuances as well.
Which you did. You did beautifully.
Yeah.
I have a whole new comprehension and layer of understanding.
Yeah. There was an excerpt that was published in the New Yorker last summer, which was kind of the first thing that had been published from the book. And I found out that the Rasta brethren in Montego Bay have a group chat. And they were sort of sharing this excerpt around in the Rasta group chat because they were very, you know, they were very happy. We can't say proud because Rasta don't feel proud, but they, you know, they felt irie to see, you know, Rastafari being, the history of Rastafari being written about. So, you know, I haven't had any personal sort of blowback. So I feel fortunate about that.
Thank you for your magnificent book. And I think there's so many universal themes in it, regardless of culture. There's a moment in the book where you show the reader rather than tell that you fear you've internalized some of your father's oppressive ways. It's an encounter with your mother. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit and how, when you've grown up in a culture like that or a religion like that, again, it could be anywhere in the world, how do we make sure that we do not treat our loved ones the way we've been treated growing up?
Mommy. It's a hard thing, right, to kind of, to become cognizant of. Like, I grew up being told, it's an interesting dichotomy because I grew up being told by my father, right, to be humble and to be obedient. But also, when I stepped out into the world, I was supposed to be a lion heart, right? The idea was that I was supposed to move through the world like a weapon, impenetrable, and that was what strength looked like. And for a long time, that was what I was like. I was very, I had a temper. I was very impatient, had a temper. And sometimes my mother, who was probably the most patient person I know, I was not always as patient with her. And there was that moment in the book where I really spoke to her with anger that way. And she said to me, I don't like that. I don't like how you You just spoke to me, which it was the first time too that she actually called my attention to it. And I thought, oh my gosh.
Well, for her, it was like your father spoke.
Yes.
It was
And for me, it was a wake-up call of like, wow, who am I becoming? And I needed to take a pause and realize, and this is another thing I learned in writing the book, that strength doesn't look one way. And in writing the book and seeing all the things that my mother had done for me since I was born, and not just, as you say, since I was 4 years old, she's been saving me. That was the first time, but not the last time she had saved me. And I could pinpoint all these different moments in my life, not just when she handed me the book of poems or when she helped me mail my poems to the editor of the paper, or when she, there was a moment at 16 where I told her I wanted to be a model, and somehow she got my father to agree. To this day, I still don't even know how.
And you went to America, too.
I did. And, the moment where she sat down and said, well, how am I going to get this money to get you into college or to pay the enrollment fee? There was every moment in my life I could see her hand was the hand that really changed these crucial moments of my life. And I said, she had always been strong. And that was something that I learned. And I'm still learning to be strong like you, patient like you, kind like you.
I can't think of a better way to close. It's been a powerful day today. It's been a powerful festival. We thank all of you for being with us. We believe in our mission, all of us at the Nantucket Book Festival and Foundation, our mission really is that we so believe words can change the world. Let everyone tell their story. Thank you so much for being with us. And Safiya, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.